Great pleasure to welcome everybody here today. This is actually the 2024 Geary lecture. That's the first thing I need to point out. In a moment I'll introduce Christian, but we had asked Christian to come along last year, and it wasn't possible to find a date in the calendar year 2024, but we were sufficiently excited to have Christian with us that we just moved last year's lecture into 2025. So you're all very, very welcome to the 2024 Geary lecture, which is on understanding immigration, labour markets policy and public perception, to be delivered by Christian. In a moment, a word about Christian, but firstly to say, we always like to mention at the start of the annual Geary lecture that of course the Geary lecture is in honour of our first director, Roy Geary, who goes back to the 1960s, a very distinguished individual, and for recent recruits into the ESRI, you'll know that I still always talk in the induction programme that we do for our recruits about what an extraordinary individual Roy Geary was, remarkably distinguished, and one of those people who has a whole range of theorems and other things named after him. So he, in a sense, is still in a sense a sort of spiritual leader of the ESRI. He really believed in that notion of academic excellence on the one hand, but policy relevance on the other. And I mean, to this day, 65 years after the foundation of the Institute under his guidance, we're still essentially trying to do the same thing, which is to produce research of the absolute highest quality, but with a very, very strong policy orientation. Always wonderful to welcome members of the Geary family. So we've got Roy and Kevin Dooney, the grandson and great-grandson of Roy. And again, over the years, we've had that connection. And again, it's a great pleasure, as always, to welcome the two of you back here today. So now a word about Christian, and I'll have to read through not every last line on the CV or anything like that, but just give an overall sense. So Christian Dustmann, Professor of Economics at University College London and Honorary Professor at the Humboldt University in Berlin. And Christian has been a visiting professor at UC Berkeley, Harvard, Princeton, Stanford and Yale. He has served as president of the European Association of Labour Economists and also the European Society for Population Economics. He was elected, or is an elected fellow of the British Academy, the German Academy of Sciences, the Academy of Europe, the Econometric Society and the Society of Labour Economists. In 2020, he received the Karl Friedrich von Weizsäcker Prize from the German National Academy of Sciences for his scientific contributions to socially important challenges, becoming the first economist to be honoured with that prize. So a leading labour economist has worked in the area of migration, the economics of education, the economics of crime, social networks, technology, income mobility, wage dynamics and inequality. So as you can see, a remarkably distinguished career. I had the pleasure of meeting Christian, I think for the first time, maybe about 30 years ago. Something like that. So it's quite a long time, and I followed his career with great interest. It's a remarkable contribution, but we asked him to come along today to talk about the specific issue of immigration. And one of the reasons for doing that, this is obviously a very important topic, but it's also a very controversial topic. And if there's, obviously there's lots of things we like to do in the Institute, but the idea of having a sort of a well-informed debate and discussion, a sort of an evidence-based discussion on immigration, we thought this was a really, really valuable thing to do. And given Christian's contribution to the science of immigration, to immigration research, we thought he would be an ideal speaker. So Christian will speak for about 40-45 minutes. We should have some time then for questions and answers after that. So with that, it's my honour and pleasure to welcome Christian to the podium.
So, thanks a lot, Alan. Here we go. And thanks a lot for the invitation. It's a great honor to give the Geary lecture this year. I remember my microeconomics classes, the Stone-Geary utility function, and many other things which this great economist actually gave to our field. So I'm very pleased and I'm very honored to be able to speak to you at this occasion. So the title of my talk is Understanding Immigration, Labour Markets, Policy and Public Perception. As Alan pointed out, migration has become one of the key issues in the public debate not just in Ireland or in Europe, but also on the other side of the Atlantic and also increasingly in Asian countries. Now, when I started thinking about a topic for my PhD, which was in the late 80s, in 89, I kind of stumbled over the topic of migration, and I thought that's fascinating. At that time, migration was basically dealt with only by trade economists. It was about the movement of the factor labor between countries or regions. And there were 2 or 3 people in the US who actually looked at data, Barry Chiswick and George Borjas. And I thought, well, there's nothing in Europe, and we have actually migration, but nobody talks about it. So I started looking into that, and I talked to some senior colleagues and said, oh, I want to work on migration. And they all told me, Christian, don't do it. This will kill your career. And in fact, there wasn't any big hype about any of the stuff I did in my PhD or the 10 years afterwards. It was difficult to publish papers on migration. For instance, the Journal of Human Resources at the time didn't publish any migration papers, and other journals were very critical about this particular topic. Now, this has completely changed. And the reason that has changed has to do, of course, with the numbers first. So it used to be a phenomenon of the New World. When we thought about migration in Europe, we thought about the United States, Canada, Australia. We didn't think, certainly, about Ireland being an immigration country. When I did my PhD in Italy, Italy was an emigration country. It was not an immigration country. And so was the entire south of Europe. Exceptions were the northern countries, including the UK, which drew migrants already from the late 50s onwards. If you look at the world number of international migrants, 1995, 2.8% of the world population, 2019, 3.5% of the world population, and it is increasing further. Same thing in countries like Europe, North America, Australia, New Zealand. The share of migrants on the population has dramatically increased. I give you just some numbers. On the left, we have the US. On the right, we have Switzerland. And what you can see here is, first of all, the black bars. That was the share of foreign-born on the population in 2000. And the green bars are the share 2024, so 1/4 of a century later. What you see in this figure is that the share of foreign-born in every country has increased dramatically. In Ireland, it has basically more than doubled. Same thing in Austria, New Zealand, and Australia and Switzerland are the countries with the highest share, where 1 in 3 people today is actually born in another country. Not surprisingly, therefore, migration has kind of moved from the back of a debate into the very front. And that is not just because economists are interested in it, but increasingly politicians are increasingly interested in migration because it becomes such an important and sensitive political issue. So this is kind of numbers on Ireland. As I just pointed out, the share of foreign-born in Ireland, which used to be an emigration country, has increased very sharply. Net migration to Ireland, when we kind of look at the last years since 2017, here is basically inflows, outflows, and net migration. Net migration is always the difference between inflows and outflows. You can see that this black line has been actually below zero at the end of the 1980s. That was the last part of the period where Ireland was actually sending more people abroad than it absorbed. But over the last years, this has dramatically changed. Now, migration, however, is not a homogeneous phenomenon, although we very often discuss it like that. It is highly heterogeneous. The composition of the immigrant population differs across countries with respect to ethnicity, origin, and educational composition. And that's very important because that composition is important for how we think about the economic consequences of migration. So if we look, for instance, at education. So this is the share of tertiary educated in selected EU countries in 2018. Ireland is basically topping that list with about 1 in 2 foreign-born having a tertiary degree. I was very surprised about that. I always thought the UK is topping that kind of league table. But actually Ireland has an even higher share of highly educated migrants among its population. Compare that to Germany, where that share is only half, and where migration is far less well educated. So only that is already explaining very different economic consequences of migration for the country that receives migrants. The composition with respect of origin is also very different. So a very high share of immigrants to Ireland are actually from the UK. Poland is another important source country, Lithuania, Romania, and then also United States. Very different, for instance, in Switzerland, where Morocco, Romania, Ecuador, Colombia, and then the UK sorry, that must be wrong. Okay, so that is wrong. That's Spain and not Switzerland, because the highest share in Switzerland is actually individuals from Germany. So that's wrong. UK, India, Poland, Pakistan, Romania, Germany, Poland, Turkey, Russia, etc. So you see very different compositions of the migrant population in terms of origin, in terms of education, in terms of ethnicity, in terms of age composition, etc. And that's very important to be kept in mind. Immigration, when it's discussed in this country, discusses something else than when it is discussed in Spain, in Italy, or in Germany. Now, another phenomenon which has become increasingly important, actually only over the last 1.5 decades, is migration which appeals to the 1951 Geneva Convention. Yeah, migration which is not for economic reasons, but for reasons of persecution of individuals who seek asylum, appealing to the 1951 Geneva Convention and its appendices. And what you can see here is actually that really started to take off when we had the Syrian conflict, where the numbers really started to become very high. And much of the debate we have in the political arena these days is about this type of migration and not about the actually much larger migration which is economically motivated. So I would like to spend some time to talk about what we are actually doing in economics. So one of the big issues on migration is what are the economic effects of immigration, how can we measure them, and what are the empirical challenges to do that. And secondly, I would like to talk about something related to that. Suppose we knew everything about how migration impacts on our economies, which we don't. But suppose we would. Would that actually matter very much for the way individuals form their attitudes and their views about migration? So my talk will be divided in those two subsections. Now, a key question in the public debate on migration is how does immigration affect the welfare of residents in the receiving country? We as labor economists think about migration as a very particular event. We think about it as a labor supply shock. We think about it as something which impacts on the working population in our countries by actually extending them, by making them larger. And by doing that, we can kind of link in to a ready-made framework of economic theory, which then allows us to derive empirical implications and to measure the effect immigration may have on the receiving population. And I will talk about that particular issue today. So there are at least 3 different ways in which the receiving country can adjust to such a labor supply shock. The first is absorption through changes in wages and employment. The second is absorption through changes in the industry structure. Now, what does that mean? Well, suppose you have 2 different types of workers, educated and non-educated. And you have two types of industries. Industries which produce a good, which use educated workers intensively, and an industry which uses goods, which uses non-educated workers more intensively. And now you get a labor supply shock. And you are a small trading economy like Ireland. So you trade on international markets, both goods. Then one way to adjust to immigration is to increase production of that industry, which uses the now more abundant factor labor. Suppose immigration is less educated, so less educated workers more intensively. And the third way to do that is absorption through technology. Now, I'm in Ireland, and I'm sure there are many people who appreciate a good glass of wine. Is that true? So whenever I go somewhere where they grow wine, I go to the vineyards, and I go to the wineries because I find that very exciting. Now, if you go to Napa Valley, and you compare that to Barossa Valley. Napa Valley is in California, Barossa Valley is in Australia. And you go through the vineyards. You find the same wines, Cabernets, in the supermarket next door. One from Australia, one from Napa, for the same price. However, the way of production is very different. If you go to Barossa, it's highly capitalized. So the wine is having broader avenues between the different wine stocks, and there are machines going through who harvest the wine. In Napa, much of the harvest is still done by hand. And the reason is that cheap labor is much easier to come by in Napa Valley, because you have huge immigration from Mexico into the United States, and many of those Mexicans are working in agriculture. It's very difficult in Australia. So one way for an economy to absorb immigration is by changes in technology. And that is just an example. We can see that in many other areas. So I would like to talk today about this first mechanism, which has been studied very intensively. So I wouldn't be an economist if I wouldn't work with the models. And I will take you through the simplest possible model, which gives us some interesting ideas about how we can expect immigration or an immigration shock to affect wages and employment. And that will take me 5 minutes, so if you're not interested, don't listen to it. Okay? So we have the simplest possible economy here. We have an economy which is producing output using capital, and I assume that capital is infinitely elastic. So whatever capital you need, you get for the going price. Yeah? So for a small country like Ireland, that may be actually not a bad assumption. You have skilled labor and you have unskilled labor. Production is following constant returns to scale, and capital is perfectly elastic in supply, as I just said. So before immigration, the economy is in full employment. This would be our economy. On the vertical axis, we have wages of unskilled workers. And I will focus at the moment on the wages and the labor market of unskilled workers. The downward sloping curve, Ellen has told me I'm not supposed to go away from here, so I take this a little bit with me. So the downward sloping curve is the labor demand curve. This curve is the labor supply curve. And I assume here that labor is completely inelastic in supply. This is an equilibrium. So that's the equilibrium of that simplest possible economy. And in that equilibrium, this is the initial supply of labor. Everybody is employed. And this here is the wage. So when migration happens, so this here is GDP, and this is the part of GDP which goes to unskilled workers. The blue is the part of GDP that goes to skilled workers. Migration will basically shift out the labor supply curve. We move down the demand curve, and we end up in another equilibrium. That equilibrium pays a lower wage. It redistributes, therefore, part of this square here from unskilled labor to skilled labor. but it also creates something which wasn't there before in that economy, and that's an immigration surplus. So in the simplest possible model, and in a model where we exclude the other two adjustment mechanisms, migration will increase the overall welfare of the receiving country, but it will not be Pareto improving. It will lead some workers to win, in this case skilled workers, and some workers to potentially lose. And these are the unskilled workers. Now that's the simplest possible model. Now you can extend that into many directions. And you can introduce also the mechanisms I have pointed out before. However, this model has been used as kind of the workhorse of empirical analysis of potential wage and employment effects because it is so simple and has simple implications which we always start first to test in our data. Now, the general lesson from this is immigrants differ in skills. If immigrants differ in skills, okay, let me just move on because I kind of said all that. So how do we deal with that empirically? Well, the empirical research tries to estimate the causal effect of migration on, in my example here, in my application, wages and employment of residents. And that's a huge challenge. That's, for instance, something we found very difficult in the late 90s to explain to the Labour government. They said, that's very easy. You just look at wages and see how they change. No, it's not so easy. Because what we observe after migration has happened are the wages of, say, Irish in that particular instance. What we want to compare that with is a counterfactual situation which would be observed had migration not happened. So we need to compare something we observe, wages after migration, with something we don't observe, wages with how they would look like had migration not happened. And that is very challenging. So the entire empirical literature on migration and its impact is basically trying to address that particular challenge. And the distinction between a good paper and a bad paper is the plausibility with which academic studies are addressing that particular problem. Okay? So what's the basic idea? How do we do that? Well, the way we do that is we take the labor market and slice the labor market into sub-labor markets. And these sub-labor markets differ in terms of immigration inflow. So the easiest way to do that is to take different regions in a country. So migration happens, and different regions are differently affected. So that creates variation in the exposure to immigrants. So we could then compare the changes in wages or in employment in a particular region and relate that to the changes regions have experienced in terms of immigrant inflow. Now, that's not quite where we would like to be. There's still a problem because immigrants are kind of choosy. They don't go to an area without jobs or with low wages. They go to areas where wages are high and where they can find jobs. Okay? So we need to do something about that as well. And one of the first papers was David Cart's Mariel Boat Lift, where he basically looked at individuals coming from Cuba to Miami and only to Miami. So he compared the Miami labor market with the labor market of 5 other big cities in the United States. And he assumed that the other 5 cities would have developed like Miami would have developed if migration to Miami would not have happened. So that was the assumption he made. If you find it plausible, you believe his results. If you don't find it plausible, you don't. And of course, as you can imagine, in subsequent years, there has been a huge debate about that particular paper. Many studies have followed. But that's kind of the key idea, how we try to address the problem, to give politicians an answer to the question, what is the causal effect of immigration on wages or employment, okay? So I would like to talk about two papers we have done using a similar experiment than the experiment of David Card. And I'm doing that for two reasons. First of all, to illustrate to you the idea of how you can use what we call a natural experiment to identify employment and or wage effects of immigration. And secondly, to illustrate to you that the range of questions politicians are interested in are sometimes sounding very similar, but give very different answers. So when we do empirical work, we have to be incredibly careful to really very carefully phrase the questions which our data allow us to identify. And by doing that, I will also illustrate to you that one of the biggest progresses in empirical work we have made over the last 15, maybe 20 years is the availability of much more potent data, which has much more information, and more information allows us to address questions which we otherwise could not answer. And that's an appeal to everybody who is responsible for data. Give us the data, and we make sure that you get answers to your questions which will allow politicians to implement better policies. Okay? So we are going back in time. We are going back in time to the years of the end of history. 1989, the wall came down. We started a decade of optimism, very, very different from what it's actually, yeah. So there were better times. And at that time, Germany had just reunified. And there was a huge enthusiasm in Germany about Europe, a lot of emphasis on developing those countries that were hidden behind the Iron Curtain. Now, in order to kind of support those countries, Germany announced a commuting scheme. And that commuting scheme was implemented in January 1991. And what it did was, it gave work permits to Czechs in West German districts that were close to the Czech border. So you could then go by car from Czech Republic to West Germany. You could work in any company within a very clearly defined locational area, but nowhere else. And they made sure you go back in the evening. Okay? Now, that was a scheme that was part of a larger policy, which was aimed at making it easier for non-Germans to work in Germany. And similar schemes were applied to Polish East German border, but that's not analyzable because East Germany, of course, was also hidden behind the Iron Curtain for many decades at that particular point in time. So what we do here is to actually use this policy as a variation which allows us to identify the impact immigration has on wages and employment. So this is Germany. The light area is West Germany. The dark area is East Germany. And this red and blue areas are those areas of West Germany to which the Czechs who were living, this is the Czech Republic, in this area were allowed to commute into and to work. And this was very strictly enforced. So there were some companies, we went and made interviews with all these guys who were living in those areas. There were some companies on the one side of the street who could employ Czech workers and not the companies on the other side of the street because they were in a different district. Yeah. So why is this such an interesting policy? Well, first of all, it is basically doing the same than the Mariel boat lift. So we could now compare this blue area and wages and employment to other areas in Germany that are very similar in the pre-migration period, but who could not attract Czech workers. And secondly, we have another identification possibility, and that is the further you are living away from the border, the costlier it will be for you to actually work in West Germany. So distance to the border is basically what we call an instrument or a variation which creates differences in the exposure of this blue area to immigration. Okay? Now that is an example how we can causally identify effects of immigration on wages and employment. And we are focusing on this blue area here. So just to give you an idea how important that was, 1990 was the year before the policy implementation. 91, the policy was implemented, and by 92, the share of Czechs on the workforce in this entire blue area had jumped up to 3%. That's a huge immigration shock. In areas very close to the border, it had jumped up to 10%, and further away to 1 or 2%. So there was variation within, but also variation of the blue area compared to other areas in Germany. So what we will investigate is the impact of that inflow on outcomes of native workers between 1990 and the inflow between 1990 and 1993 on outcomes up to 1998. Okay. Now, let me ask two questions you may want to ask as a policymaker. And I'm coming to the second point I want to stress in this presentation, and that is the importance of being very precise about the questions we ask and the answers we get from our empirical analysis. And I can tell you, we have many papers where the question that is asked in the introduction is not the question which is answered in the conclusion. So the first question is, what is the impact of an immigration shock on local wages and employment? Okay? Just think about that. Second question is, what is the impact of an immigration shock on wages and employment of individuals who were employed in the area at the time of the shock? So which question would you think is important? The first question, the second question, or both questions? Which question do you think is discussed in the media? Second one? Who thinks the second one? Who thinks the first one? Who thinks both? Okay, so we have a clear polarization here. That's fitting for those times we are in. Some want the first, some want the second. Now, one thing is very clear. If you look at the public debate, do you think that policymakers and the media are distinguishing between these two questions? No, right? Okay, the first question is the question which is commonly answered in the economic literature. The question is answerable with what we call repeated cross-sectional data. Data which are a snapshot in time in every year. The second question is far more difficult to answer. That question requires longitudinal data to answer. So data where we observe the same individual at many points in time. And the availability of administrative data allows us actually to answer questions like this one. Now, let me give you the answers to that. So this is the regional effect of migration. And this is the answer to the first question. So it's the impact of an immigration shock on local wages and employment. And what you see is that this particular immigration had actually a very large employment effect. I don't show you the wage effects, we don't have time for that. They are actually very, very small, and there are reasons for that. Yeah? So basically, a 10 percentage point increase in the inflow of Czech workers decreases local native employment by 8.7%. That's a large effect. However, that does not mean that for every immigrant who comes into the blue area, 0.87 natives go into non-employment. If we want to answer the second question, we need to look at the displacement effect. And here we find that a 10 percentage point increase in the inflow of Czech workers between 1990 and 1992 decreases employment probabilities of natives employed in the area in 1990 by only 1.5%, and in all the other years, that's not even statistically significant. So those workers who work when the immigration shock happens are actually not affected in terms of employment. So by suggesting you answer that question with the empirical analysis of the second, of the regional effect, which I have pointed out, you of course make a big mistake. Yeah? So those individuals who were working when migration happens are not affected. Only those individuals, only the regional effect is actually quite significant. And the reason the regional effect is significant is because we can decompose this effect here, the regional effect, in the displacement effect, in the crowding out effect. And the crowding out effect is basically the impact of migration on those who have not worked in the area when migration happened. And the relocation effect, individuals who leave the area and find employment somewhere else. So the regional effect is basically large only because of the crowding out effect. The relocation effect, for those who have worked on migration, I know Ellen has done that 30 years ago, the big debate between George Borchers and David Card was how big the relocation effect is. Relocation effect is very small. Displacement effect is very small. Yeah, the answer to the second question. What is large is basically the non-happening inflows into those areas where immigrants are working. And we can go a little bit further into detail here. So this is the regional effect, which I pointed out. This is the displacement effect. The crowding out effect, which basically is the largest part of the employment effect, and the relocation effect. So let's just focus on this effect here. Now, this crowding out effect may be because non-happening inflows from non-employment or inflows from employment in other regions which is not happening. Okay, so the majority of this effect is because individuals who otherwise would have entered the labor market are not entering the labor market. And we can then again distinguish between whether this comes from non-happening inflows from other regions, from the same region, or from individuals who actually have not entered the labor market yet. And if you kind of look at the crowding out effect, half of it is due to individuals who would have entered the labor market in that region which was exposed to migration, not entering the labor market as a response to the migration shock. And we look also at those individuals in more detail. So these are young people who would have entered the labor market but who prefer, because migration happens, to acquire more education. We see them at colleges, and we see them in particular in apprenticeship schemes. Yeah? So this immigration shock had a large regional impact. Half of that regional impact is actually explained by individuals who would have entered the labor market as young workers, unskilled, to actually say, okay, well, too many immigrants, their wages are too low, I go and do an apprenticeship scheme. Yeah. And the impact on those who have been in the workforce when migration happened is actually very small. Okay. So I think there are two things which I want to emphasize here. The first thing, we can only identify those effects because we have data which is better than the data our colleagues had 20 years ago. So the information we have in data which allows us to follow individuals over time allows us to identify and answer many more questions which are important for policy. This is just kind of a snapshot of that paper. There are many other questions which we can actually answer with that type of data. And the second thing I want to emphasize is that in applied work, it is incredibly important to be very, very careful about which questions our data actually answers. Yeah. So some questions which sound very, very similar have dramatically different answers. Okay? And that's, of course, also important for politicians when they actually screen empirical work or read empirical work. So they may have some question in mind, but then they are informed by a paper which answers a different question. Okay? Okay. So I think I have another 15 minutes. Is that? Okay. So I would like to take you now a little bit away from that. This was just an attempt to illustrate a little bit to you what we are doing when we work on migration or many other applied issues of relevance or non-relevance. Yeah? What the challenges are and how careful we have to be to actually do work which is having a causal interpretation and which is precise in the way that it addresses the questions the public or politicians actually want to have answered. Now suppose we knew all that, and of course we don't, but suppose we know everything about the impact immigration has on labor markets, and we inform the public about that. Would that actually matter? Would that matter for the way individuals are thinking about migration policy? Now that was a question which my colleague Ian Preston and I asked ourselves in the late 90s. So that's when Tony Blair's government started an empirically based policy. Yeah? So they had many different studies going on minimum wages, on immigration, on education, teams of academics looking at data and trying to understand what the data tells us, and based on that to do policy. That was actually a pretty golden time compared to some of the developments we have seen afterwards. Now, at that time, we actually asked ourselves the question, well, even if we knew all that, would that actually make a difference? So what actually affects the way individuals think about immigration? And we did a study based on the British Attitude Survey, which is not dissimilar to what I'm telling you here today. And we then teamed up with Dave Card in the late 90s. That was when there was a competition for the first survey of the European Social Survey. And they wanted to have, suggestions for modules on particular topic. And we suggested a topic on immigration. And the aim was trying to answer what are the factors that actually determine the policy views individuals have about immigration. So immigration policy could be affected by individuals' perception of the effect of immigration. Oh, sorry, this is And individuals' perception of the effect of immigration could be informed by the effect of immigration on the economy. So that's what many economists are trying to find out. But it could also be affected by non-economic considerations that affect these attitudes. So what is the relative importance of these two factors? So the hypothesis we started off with was that the attitudes to immigration, and look, this is an old paper, but I'm still talking about it because I think it became more and more relevant while we move on in time. Because this is, I think, at the core of why migration is such a difficult issue for centrist political parties. Yeah, I'll come back to that when I conclude. So the hypothesis is that the attitudes to immigration policy reflect a combination of concerns over social-cultural factors and direct economic impacts on wages and taxes. So on the fiscal part and on the kind of labor market part. So what is more important? As I said, and I will only talk about that study, we used the European Social Survey 2002 WAVE, which was in the field in 22 countries, and we designed a detailed module on immigration, which had 60 questions. And that gave us information about respondents' characteristics, but also their attitudes towards a multitude of issues. The immigration module distinguishes between different sources of immigration according to similar and different ethnicity or richer or poor origin countries. So one interesting thing when we did that was that we had some experience with the British Attitude Survey. And then we wanted to translate the whole thing into an international survey in 22 countries. And we actually realized this is really, really hard. Because the same term is not translatable necessarily into different languages. And the same situation doesn't exist. So in the British Attitude Survey, there is distinction drawn between the large ethnic groups which immigrate to the UK. But those don't exist in the Netherlands or in Germany or in Italy. Yeah? So you need to find another way of phrasing all these questions. For me, that was a great learning experience, and we did that with the team at the ESS. So let me just give you some interesting descriptives before I come to the analysis. So what we have here in this graph is the sentiment for more immigration. So the question is, would you favor more or less migration on a 10-point scale? And on the horizontal axis, we have the sentiment for more migration for high-educated young individuals. We distinguish here between 4 demographic groups: young high-educated, young low-educated, mature high-educated, and mature low-educated. Okay? Those 4 groups. This axis, high-educated young. The vertical axis, any of those 4 groups. So the line here will be the attitude of high-educated young, because they are basically on both axes, so they need to be on a straight line. Every point below that line means that that particular demographic group has a more negative attitude towards more migration, and every point above that line means that that demographic group has a more positive attitude towards more migration. Now, moving horizontally is for different countries. So this here, for instance, is Hungary, and this is Greece. They have been the most critical countries about migration. At the very right upper corner is Sweden. Scandinavian countries have always been very positive about more migration. And if you do that in today's survey, it still looks more or less exactly the same. Okay, has been very little movement. But what is interesting here is that every other demographic group has a more negative attitude towards more migration than the well-educated young. In particular, the low-educated, more mature individuals. Okay? So that is something which we find in most attitudinal data. There's a strong demographic divide. So let's go back to our simple model I pointed out before. You know, the little model where some of you may just have looked at your telephones. So let me just summarize what that model actually implied. If immigration is low-skilled, which has been the case for most of those countries, then those individuals who would potentially be harmed by immigration are actually the low-skilled, okay? Because they are competing with immigrants. So that would be in line with this particular diagram here. In fact, the low-skilled are actually less positive towards migration. Now, there was a literature in the early 2000s which looked at attitudinal data and based on the little model I have shown you, concluded that actually the low-skilled should be more negative towards migration because they are competing more with immigrants. When we saw that, we thought, well, that's only the case if economic reasons are the only reason for which individuals form different attitudes about immigration. But there may be something else. So I'll take that up in a minute, okay? I'll come back to that when we interpret the results of our analysis. Now, our hypothesis was that economic considerations are important, but socio-cultural factors may play an even bigger role. And we test that by constructing two factors out of the questions we have asked. And we asked the questions very carefully to actually inform those factors. One factor, economic concerns, and another factor, socio-cultural concerns. We then estimate a kind of complicated model, but the idea is very simple, where here on the left-hand side, you have an outcome question. And I will just focus on this here. Would you like to restrict access for immigrants from different types of countries? And on the right-hand side, we have these latent factors. The one is the economic factor, and the other one is the socio-cultural factor. Now, those factors were again informed by a list of questions. Do you agree or disagree that wages and salaries are brought down by immigration? Do we agree or disagree that immigrants harm the economic prospects of the poor, etc., etc.? The second factor, the socio-cultural factor, was informed by another set of questions. Do you agree or disagree that it is better for a country if everyone shares the same customs and traditions? Is it better for a country if there is a variety of different religions? Do you agree or disagree that it is better for a country if everybody speaks the same language? So basically these underlying fears of diversity and things kind of being mixed up informs the second factor, okay? Now, what are the findings? Well, let me just give you only one graph. The economic factor is basically by factor 5 less important than the social cultural factor. And we can turn the data and put the questions in ways however we want. Yeah? So the really important factor is not what immigration may do to the fiscal, what the fiscal effect is or what the labor market effect is. The really important factor are social cultural concerns. And these results are very stable, and they are basically the same results Ian and I found 5-6 years earlier in the British Attitude Survey. Now, however, so this is more or less migration, what I've shown you in the previous graph, just to show you that actually this makes sense. If we ask the question whether immigration is good or bad for the economy, it is actually the economic factor which is important. And if we ask the question whether immigration makes the country a better or worse place to live, it is again the social cultural factor, but the economic factor plays a role as well. But the question whether we should have more or less migration is informed mainly by the social cultural factor. And that's a factor which is very hard to grasp, has to do with intrinsic fears, with concerns, which are not easily rationalizable, and they are not easily discussed and informed about. Okay. And these are exactly the type of fears and concerns which we see now politicized at particular parts of the political spectrum. Now, let me come back to this gap I have shown you. This gap I have shown you between tertiary and primary educated individuals. So that gap was about 13 percentage points in terms of whether you would like to have more or less migration. Yeah? On a scale from 0 to 1, it was 0.13. Yeah? So the better educated were far more positive. Now, the simple economic model, which I had on the slides at the very start, would explain that basically by labor market concerns. However, we can use our model to see where this gap is coming from. Is it coming from those who are less educated having more economic concerns about migration? Or is it because those individuals have more social-cultural concerns? And it is mainly explained by social-cultural concerns. Yeah. We can do that for every country. Now, these are economic concerns, these are social-cultural concerns, and this is the line which basically would suggest that both concerns are equally important. As you can see, for every country, except for this little dot here, and that is Luxembourg, every country, the social-cultural concern is more important than the economic concern. But there is, of course, variation. Okay? Now, what about immigrants themselves? Well, we have a large population of immigrants already in the 2000 ESS, and they think about it not very differently. Yeah? Also for immigrants, the social-cultural concern about more or less migration is far more important than the economic concern, although the difference is not quite as large as it is for natives. Now, coming back to the question we started off with, immigration policy is clearly impacted by individuals' perception of the effect of immigration. So that informs their way of thinking about it. Now, those effects may have economic, rational reasons, or they may be informed by non-economic considerations. And what we find in this work is that actually it's the non-economic considerations which really matter. And that's a little bit a depressing end result, but also one which I believe is very important, because I firmly believe that we need to take those concerns very seriously, and we need to address them. And kind of that is all I have to say about that. So we have basically a new center which we start in Berlin, RF Berlin, Rockwool Foundation Berlin, Institute for the Economy and the Future of Work. And you find a lot of stuff on migration on our website and on our Twitter account. So please be welcome to write to us if you would like to know anything about migration. Thank you very much.